The year was 1887, and the air in the Kentucky woods hung thick with rot and rain. A lone horse-drawn carriage wound its way through the mud-choked path, carrying a photographer named Elijah Crane and his battered equipment trunk. He had been summoned by telegram, an unusual request from a family so far removed from town life that even the postmaster had hesitated before sending it on. The message had been brief: "Come at once. We need the boy remembered." By the time Elijah reached the farmhouse, dusk had already drowned the valley in gray. The house stood crooked on its foundation, its walls swollen with damp and age. A woman greeted him at the door, her eyes red but dry, her voice thin as paper. She led him inside without a word. The smell of decay was faint, like something sweet left too long in the sun. In the corner, beneath an oil lamp's trembling glow, lay the boy. He couldn't have been more than 10. Pale, delicate, untouched by the rot Elijah had come to expect in such work. His lips were colorless, his hair neatly combed, his hands folded across his chest. But there was something in his face, something too peaceful, too still, as if he were listening to something beneath the floorboards. Elijah unpacked his camera, each motion deliberate, rehearsed. He had photographed the dead before. In those times, a picture was often the only proof a family had that a life had existed at all. But this felt different. The room seemed to hold its breath as he adjusted the light. When he peered through the lens, his pulse faltered. The boy's eyes, closed a moment ago, now seemed half open. Watching him. The mother murmured something from behind, her tone reverent and trembling. "He don't like the flash much. But you'll get your picture. He always shows himself to them what needs to see." Outside, thunder rolled over the hills, and the wind whispered through the boards. Elijah pressed the shutter. The flash lit the room in white for just an instant, but in that instant, he swore he saw the boy smile. And then, something moved. In the late autumn of 1887, deep within the misty folds of rural Kentucky, a telegram reached a small-town photographer named Elijah Crane. The message was written in an uneven, almost trembling hand, requesting his immediate presence at a remote farmhouse on the edge of the Appalachian woods. The sender identified themselves only as the Whitlock family and mentioned a boy, dead for several weeks, who needed to be remembered through a photograph. Elijah had handled death portraits before, a common practice in those years, but something about this message unsettled him. It was the phrasing, the urgency, and the way the word "remembered" seemed to carry a different weight, as if it meant more than preserving a likeness. He left town before sunrise, his camera equipment packed carefully in the back of a borrowed carriage. The road grew narrower with every mile, the forest thickening around him until the trees seemed to close in, their branches forming a canopy that blotted out the sun. The air was heavy, damp, filled with the earthy scent of decay. As he approached the foothills, the silence of the landscape pressed in on him, broken only by the creaking of wheels and the distant cry of crows. Elijah was not an easily frightened man, but he found himself glancing over his shoulder more than once, unable to shake the feeling that he was being watched from the woods. When he finally saw the Whitlock home, it appeared as if the forest had been trying to reclaim it. The house leaned slightly to one side, its roof sagging beneath years of rain, its windows clouded with grime. Smoke rose faintly from a crooked chimney, the only sign of life. A woman stood waiting on the porch when he arrived, her face drawn and pale. She said nothing as he introduced himself, only turned and motioned for him to follow. Inside, the air was colder than outside, and the smell hit him, something faintly metallic, sweet, and old. The furniture was sparse, the walls bare, except for a single cross nailed above the doorway. The boy's body lay in the next room, shrouded in a white cloth on a wooden table. Even from the doorway, Elijah could tell something was off. The air around the body seemed unnaturally still, and though the telegram had said the boy had been dead for weeks, there was no sign of decomposition. His skin was pale but unblemished, his lips slightly parted as though caught between breaths. Elijah hesitated before unpacking his camera, aware that he was standing on the edge of something that was no longer just grief or remembrance, but something far older, colder, and hidden beneath the roots of that mountain soil. As Elijah stepped into the Whitlock homestead, the air felt heavier, as if soaked with years of silence and secrets. The room was dimly lit by a single oil lamp that cast long, wavering shadows across the walls, making the space feel smaller, almost suffocating. The woman who had greeted him, presumably the boy's mother, moved with a quiet, mechanical grace, her eyes glassy and distant. She spoke little, and when she did, Her voice carried the tremor of someone who had forgotten what comfort sounded like. She gestured toward a side room and whispered, "He's waiting," before disappearing down the hallway. Elijah hesitated. Something about her words struck him. Waiting was not how people spoke of the dead. The photographer's boots creaked against the warped wooden floor as he crossed the narrow passage. The deeper he went, the colder the air became, as though the warmth of the living had been drawn out of the house long ago. The walls were lined with strange markings, carvings and scratches that might have been made by a knife, curling symbols that resembled twisted branches or veins. He brushed his fingers over one as he passed, and for a fleeting second, it felt warm, pulsing faintly beneath the skin of the wood. He withdrew his hand quickly and told himself it was his imagination. The house gave off a feeling that he couldn't quite define. It was not merely sorrow or decay, it was awareness. He had spent years entering homes where death had left its quiet signature, the hush of mourning, the scent of wilted flowers, the heavy air of resignation. But here, the silence wasn't mourning, it was watching. Every creak of the boards under his feet echoed longer than it should have, as if the walls were listening. A door stood at the end of the hallway, slightly ajar, a thin sliver of pale lamplight seeping through the gap. As he approached, Elijah heard the faintest sound, a low hum, rhythmic and almost human, coming from inside. It stopped the instant he touched the doorframe. He waited, breath held, but all that followed was the whisper of the wind rattling through the broken window panes. When he finally pushed the door open, his eyes adjusted to the dim glow and settled on the table in the center of the room. The boy lay there, perfectly still beneath a white sheet, a thin wisp of hair peeking from beneath it. The smell of herbs and old wood filled the space, masking something darker beneath. Elijah felt the instinct to retreat, to turn back before the threshold swallowed him whole, but the same strange pull that had drawn him through the forest now urged him forward. The house seemed to exhale around him, and for the first time, he understood why the locals had warned him never to travel this far after dark. When Elijah finally drew close enough to see the boy clearly, a chill settled deep into his bones. The child could not have been older than 10, his frame delicate, almost fragile, but what struck Elijah most was the utter absence of decay. According to the telegram, the boy had been dead for nearly 3 weeks, yet there was no trace of the stiffness or discoloration that should have come with time. His skin was pale, yes, but smooth, supple, as if he were merely sleeping. His lips retained a faint rose tint, and his eyelids rested so lightly that Elijah almost expected them to flutter open at any moment. The candlelight played across his face, and with each flicker, the boy seemed to shift subtly between stillness and life, the shadows breathing over him like invisible hands. Elijah leaned closer, studying the faint line of the boy's jaw, the curve of his cheek. There was no odor of death, no sweetness of rot, only the faint scent of lavender and something colder beneath it, something mineral and sharp, like stone after rain. He had seen bodies preserved with care before, especially in wealthier homes where families used chemicals or ice to slow decay, but the Whitlocks were poor. The cracked walls, the patched floors, and the single oil lamp told him that much. Whatever had kept the boy in such pristine condition wasn't something that could be bought. It was something else entirely. The mother watched from a few steps away, her hands clasped tightly in front of her, her eyes unblinking. "He's just resting," she said softly when she saw Elijah hesitate. "The mountain keeps him." Her words made little sense, but the calm certainty with which she spoke them unsettled him. Elijah nodded wordlessly and began preparing his camera, though his hands trembled slightly as he adjusted the tripod. The air felt too still, as if the entire house was waiting for him to move, to act, to disturb the fragile quiet that hung over the room. He noticed a faint sheen along the boy's skin, like dew. It glistened under the lamplight, beating at the temples, the wrists, the hollow of the throat. When Elijah brushed a strand of hair from the boy's forehead, the skin was cool, not cold, the kind of temperature flesh holds when it has not yet surrendered completely. A low hum filled his ears, a vibration he couldn't place, and for a moment he thought it came from his own pulse. Then he realized it was coming from the table, the faintest tremor beneath the wood. The mother smiled faintly, and Elijah stepped back, his chest tightening as the truth began to form in his mind. Whatever lay before him had not stopped being human, it had only stopped pretending to be dead. Elijah steadied his breath as he prepared his camera, trying to suppress the unease coiling in his stomach. He had performed this task countless times, arranging the dead for one last portrait of dignity, freezing a family's grief into a single fragile moment. But this room was different. The silence was too complete, the air too thick. Each movement he made, the click of the tripod, the pull of the bellows, the turning of a lens, echoed unnaturally, as if the walls themselves were repeating his motions in secret. He tried to focus on the technical ritual, the comfort of routine, but his eyes kept returning to the boy. Something about that body refused to stay still in his mind. Every time he blinked, he thought he saw the faintest twitch at the corner of the boy's mouth, a ripple beneath his closed eyelids, a flicker that should not have been possible. He leaned closer, the lens barely a foot away from the boy's face. For an instant, the fingers, thin, pale things folded neatly over the chest, shifted, almost imperceptibly. Elijah froze, his breath caught halfway. The movement had been small, no more than a shiver, but unmistakable. He blinked hard, once, twice, telling himself it was his imagination, a trick of the light or the tremor of his own hands. Yet when he looked again, the boy's left index finger was curled slightly differently, as if in response to being observed. Elijah took a step back, his chair scraping the floor. From behind him came the mother's voice, quiet but firm. "It happens sometimes. Just the settling." Her tone carried no alarm, no surprise, as though she had seen this many times before. Elijah turned to her, searching her face for a hint of deception, but she only stared past him at the body, her lips moving silently. He thought she might be praying, but the words were too soft, too rhythmic, to be any prayer he knew. He swallowed, forcing himself to look back at the boy. The fingers were still again, perfectly arranged. A bead of sweat traced down his temple. He adjusted the lamp, the flame sputtering as if choked by a sudden gust of air that he could not feel. He took his position behind the camera, peering through the glass plate. The boy's face stared back, magnified and ghostly, and in that moment, Elijah saw the eyelids flutter. It was a quick, almost invisible motion, but it sent a chill down his spine so deep he thought he might collapse. The flashbulb fired, flooding the room with white light, and in that instant, Elijah swore the boy's lips had parted in the faintest whisper, forming a word he could not hear but somehow understood was meant for him alone. The days following that strange session brought whispers through the nearby villages, carried by traders and travelers who rarely ventured near the Whitlock land. They spoke of the boy's death in half-hushed tones, of how he had never spoken clearly, how his eyes were different colors, one pale as milk, the other dark as river mud. The locals called him the cursed child, the final proof of what happened when bloodlines twisted too many times upon themselves. For generations, it was said, the Whitlocks had kept to their own, marrying cousins, even siblings, until their faces began to share the same sharp angles and hollow eyes. Children born of that line were known to be quiet, strange, and short-lived. Some claimed the family carried a mark that could not be scrubbed away, not by prayer nor time, and the boy, the one Elijah photographed, was the last of them. Elijah learned this only later, but even in the moment, standing inside that crooked house, he had sensed it. The air carried something old and secret, something that seemed to hum beneath the soil. He remembered how the mother's eyes darted toward the floor whenever he asked a question, how she refused to speak of the father, and how a single closed door at the end of the hall seemed to radiate a quiet dread. When he asked if anyone else lived there, she had simply said, "Not anymore." Yet he thought he heard movement beyond that door, the faint shuffle of feet, or breathing too deep to belong to wind. The locals would later tell him that the Whitlocks believed the boy's death had freed them, that the mountain would finally release its hold on their family. But others said the opposite, that his death had angered something that had long been appeased by his presence. They claimed the boy had been different from birth, a child who spoke in voices not his own, who could recite the names of ancestors long buried beneath the ridge. They said his eyes followed people long after he turned away, that animals would not go near him, that even the birds fell silent when he walked the fields. By the time Elijah finished his work, he could feel those stories pressing against him like invisible hands. Every photograph he had taken that night seemed to hum faintly when he touched the plates, as if the image itself was alive. He did not yet know that the moment he captured the boy's likeness, he had also captured something the family had spent generations trying to contain, a bloodline's final breath that refused to fade, a curse that could not be buried because it was still looking back through the eyes of its last child. When Elijah returned to his workshop 2 days later, the storm clouds still hung low over the hills, as though the mountains themselves were unwilling to let him go. The wooden box that held his photographic plates felt heavier than usual, as if it carried more than glass and light. He tried to dismiss the feeling as exhaustion, but the unease had followed him from the Whitlock house, clinging to him like damp air. He locked the door behind him, lit his lantern, and began to prepare his chemicals. The faint smell of developer filled the room, sharp and bitter. He moved methodically, seeking comfort in the familiar rhythm of his craft: pour, tilt, rinse, hang, repeat, but something inside him whispered that this night would not end the same as the others. When the first image began to form beneath the surface of the solution, he leaned closer. Slowly, the outlines appeared: the wooden table, the pale figure, the soft folds of cloth. He felt a fleeting relief at seeing the photograph take shape correctly, proof that his equipment had not failed. But then, as the image grew sharper, that comfort dissolved. The boy's eyes, which he was certain had been closed when he took the photograph, were open. Not halfway, not by accident, but wide open, staring directly into the camera. The gaze was steady, almost human, yet there was something wrong in it, too knowing, too deliberate. Elijah's hand shook, and the tray slipped, splashing chemicals across the table. He stumbled back, breath catching in his throat. He wiped his eyes, thinking fatigue was playing tricks on him. But when he lifted the plate again, the eyes were still there. They seemed to follow him no matter where he moved, cold and focused, as though aware of his presence beyond the lens. The boy's mouth had changed too, curved in a faint, unnatural smirk that Elijah did not remember seeing. His heart pounded as he compared the rest of the photographs. Each one seemed slightly altered. In one, the boy's head tilted a fraction of an inch; in another, the angle of his hands shifted subtly, as if the body had moved between shots. Elijah dropped the final plate and backed away, his breath shallow. The photographs hung from their clips, swaying gently in the still air, the boy's gaze alive in every frame. He tried to convince himself it was an exposure error, a trick of the chemicals or the light, but deep down, he knew what he had seen in that farmhouse was not imagination. The boy had not simply been remembered, he had been seen, and now he was seeing back. That night, Elijah could not sleep. The images haunted him, their ghostly eyes burning into his thoughts long after he had covered the plates and doused the lamps. Each time he closed his eyes, he saw the boy's face again, sometimes smiling faintly, sometimes staring blankly, sometimes whispering words he could not hear. He told himself it was exhaustion, the lingering fear from that cursed house, but a cold certainty was building inside him. Something in those photographs was alive. When the wind rattled the shutters, he jumped. When his reflection shifted in the glass of his darkroom window, he flinched. Unable to rest, he decided to check the plates once more, hoping that daylight would reveal a rational flaw he had missed. But when he uncovered them, his breath stopped. The boy's position had changed again. In the first photograph, the head was tilted farther to the right; in the next, the hands had moved slightly apart, and in the last, the faint smile had disappeared entirely. Elijah stared, unblinking, as if by watching long enough he might catch the image in motion. For a terrifying moment, he thought he did. A slow, imperceptible shift in the boy's expression, like breath passing through a still form. His pulse quickened, and he stumbled back, knocking over a lamp. The flame guttered, smoke curling in the air. He grabbed the photographs and held them to the light, one after another. Each time, the boy seemed a fraction closer to the edge of the frame, his eyes clearer, sharper. Elijah dropped the plates onto the table, his hands slick with sweat. The glass rattled but did not break. It felt wrong, as if something protected them. Outside, a low hum began to rise, faint at first but steady, growing louder with every second. It wasn't the wind, it came from inside the walls, vibrating through the floorboards. Elijah's darkroom door creaked open slightly though no one stood there. The air turned icy, and for an instant, he saw the reflection of the boy's face in the window, hovering just behind him. The same pale skin, the same mismatched eyes, the same cold stare that had followed him through every frame. He stumbled out into the night, leaving his workshop door swinging open. The forest loomed black and endless beyond the field, the shadows pulsing with that same low hum. Behind him, inside the darkroom, the glass plates swayed gently on their strings. One by one, the faint outlines of the boy's form seemed to shift again, the curve of his lips rising slowly into something that almost resembled a smile, as if the act of being photographed had not trapped him but awakened him. Elijah fled into the cold night, his breath clouding in the damp air, his boots sinking into the mud as he stumbled toward the woods. The wind howled through the trees, carrying the echo of that low humming sound that had begun in his darkroom. It seemed to follow him, weaving between the branches like a voice without a body. He did not look back at first, too afraid of what he might see, but every few steps, the instinct to turn clawed at him. When he finally glanced over his shoulder, his heart stilled. Through the half-open door of his workshop, a faint glow pulsed, a sickly white light that seemed to breathe. It flickered once, then again, and he realized with horror that it was coming from the plates he had left behind. He ran harder, the forest closing in around him. Branches tore at his coat, roots caught his feet, and the night air grew colder with every step. The deeper he went, the quieter it became, until even his own footfalls seemed muffled. The humming had stopped, but the silence was worse, thick, expectant, alive. He reached a clearing and collapsed beside an old oak, trying to steady his breath. The moon hung low, pale and blurred by clouds, and in its dim light, the shadows around him seemed to shift, as if the forest itself were moving. He told himself it was exhaustion, the tricks of fear, yet he couldn't shake the sensation that something was watching him, unseen but close. When he finally forced himself to return home at dawn, the world felt wrong. The birds were silent. The trees stood too still. His workshop door was wide open, swaying gently in the morning breeze. Inside, the chemical smell was overpowering, sharp enough to sting his eyes. The plates were gone. Only the faint outlines of their absence remained on the drying line, clean patches where they had hung just hours earlier. But it wasn't only the missing photographs that froze him. On the wall opposite the line, etched into the wood by some unseen hand, were new shapes, crude, childlike drawings. They formed the outline of a small figure standing beside a taller one, both holding hands. Elijah's pulse quickened as he backed away, every hair on his neck standing on end. On the table where he had first developed the boy's image lay a single photograph he didn't remember taking. The picture showed his own darkroom, perfectly captured, and in the corner of the frame stood the boy, no longer lying on the table, but upright, facing the camera, one pale hand pressed against the glass as though trying to step through it. Years passed, and Elijah Crane's name faded into obscurity. His workshop, left abandoned after his disappearance, was eventually swallowed by the forest. The locals avoided the place, claiming strange lights flickered through the trees on moonless nights and that whispers could be heard when the wind was still. The Whitlock family home had long since collapsed into ruin, but the legend of the boy and the cursed photograph lingered like a stain on the town's memory. Few dared to speak of it aloud. Fewer still ventured anywhere near the site where it had all begun. Time, however, has a way of unearthing what should stay buried. Nearly 30 years later, in 1916, a man named Charles Hensley purchased a plot of land near the old Whitlock property. He was a surveyor by trade and a collector of curiosities by habit. He had heard the rumors of Elijah Crane's vanished photographs and thought them nothing more than the kind of ghost stories rural towns invented to fill the silence. When he discovered the remains of the workshop hidden behind a curtain of ivy and rot, curiosity overcame caution. The structure leaned dangerously to one side, the roof half-caved, the windows blackened with grime. But inside, beneath a floorboard that creaked differently under his weight, he found a box wrapped in what looked like oiled canvas, perfectly preserved despite the decay around it. Inside were the glass negatives, the same ones Elijah had taken the night he photographed the Whitlock boy. Charles held one up to the light and immediately felt a strange unease. The image was faint, cloudy with age, but the boy's face was unmistakable. His mismatched eyes seemed to pierce through the glass, alive even in shadow. The expression was wrong too, not solemn, not peaceful, but curious, as if he were aware of being found again after so many years. Charles carried the box home, telling himself he'd stumbled upon a historical treasure. But as night fell, he began to hear soft sounds from the crate, a faint tapping, irregular yet rhythmic, like fingers brushing against glass. When he opened the box again, the plates had shifted, stacked differently than before. He blamed the vibration of the journey, though part of him knew that wasn't possible. Later, as he studied one of the negatives under a lantern, he froze. The reflection staring back from the glass was not his own. Behind the faint outline of the boy's form, another figure stood, a man, gaunt and hollow-eyed, with the same haunted expression described in old town records. It was Elijah Crane, and his hand was pressed against the same side of the glass as the boy's. Charles Hensley became obsessed with the discovery. The photographs consumed him, their ghostly images haunting his waking hours as much as his dreams. He spent days studying each plate, tracing the boy's expression, the faint details in the background, the strange shimmer that seemed to move just beneath the glass surface. The longer he stared, the more certain he became that the plates weren't static, they were changing, subtly but undeniably. At first, it was only a flicker of light, a distortion of the boy's reflection. Then it became movement, the slow turn of his head, the widening of his eyes, the faint curl of a smile that hadn't been there before. Charles began recording the changes in a notebook, convinced he had stumbled upon something supernatural, perhaps even divine. But his notes soon grew frantic, filled with uneven handwriting and lines that trailed off mid-sentence. One stormy night, Charles decided to recreate Elijah Crane's process. He believed that by taking a new photograph of the original plates, he might reveal the truth behind them. He set up his equipment in his attic, carefully aligning the old negatives under a single flickering lantern. As he adjusted the lens, the light dimmed, then flared unnaturally bright. The shadows in the room deepened, thick and shifting, and a sound rose from within the box where the remaining plates were stored, a slow, rhythmic tapping, unmistakably deliberate. Charles froze. The tapping grew louder, more insistent, until the glass began to tremble. He reached out, his fingers hovering just above the nearest plate. The surface seemed to pulse with a faint warmth, as though something beneath it was alive. The boy's image stared back at him, sharper than ever, eyes gleaming with a cold intelligence. Then the lantern flickered again, and the entire room was flooded with a pale, white light. For a moment, it felt as though time itself had stilled. When the light faded, the camera's shutter snapped on its own. The next morning, neighbors found the attic door open and the equipment still running. Charles Hensley was gone. On the table sat the last photograph he had ever taken, a perfect, ghostly recreation of the original. The boy stood no longer inside the frame of the old image but in the center of Charles's attic, one hand pressed against the camera lens, his mismatched eyes glinting in the half-light. Some said the photograph was cursed, that anyone who looked too long into those eyes would hear a faint knock, as if something on the other side of the glass was asking to be let out.